We've all been hostage to a confused GPS, but Jonathan Cole had been driving through rural Texas for 3 hours on what was supposed to be a 40-minute detour. The roads just kept narrowing until the white lines faded right into the dirt. Naturally, a guy with his ego would never admit to being lost, so he chalked it up to being redirected right around the time the rain started falling. It started out soft enough, but pretty soon the sky bruised over and the radio began screaming about flash floods. That drizzle quickly turned into a massive wall of water, forcing him to pull off at a faded wooden arrow pointing toward Milbrook. If you've ever driven through the Texas Panhandle, you know exactly the kind of town Milbrook is. We're talking one blinking yellow traffic light, a rusted water tower, and a Dollar General that serves as the local hangout spot. He ended up at the Lone Pine Motel, pulling his car under a rusted awning just as lightning struck out by the grain silos. And for the first time in years, after endless corporate mergers and a grueling 24/7 hustle, Jonathan actually had nowhere to be. With his cell service completely dead and the main road flooded out, he grabbed his bag and dashed inside. The sweet older lady at the front desk handed him an actual physical metal key for $48 a night. He tossed down some cash and walked down to room 7, dropping onto the bed just to stare at the cheap paneling. Have you ever experienced that deep, heavy silence of a small town during a thunderstorm? There are no sirens or subway rattles, just rain hammering on a tin roof. For a guy who had spent his entire adult life drowned in city noise, the sheer quiet completely unraveled him. Sleep was out of the question, and by 8:40 p.m. he was starving, but the only diner in town had already shut down. So he did the most small-town thing possible. He hopped on a local community Facebook page the motel clerk mentioned and messaged a few locals. One guy shot back a quick reply telling him to look for a yellow gate next to the motel where a woman named B sometimes cooked late orders. Jonathan walked over to the house, getting his custom suit soaked in the downpour, and knocked. The gate instantly flew open, but it wasn't B greeting him. 70 pounds of pure golden retriever energy slammed right into his chest, tackling him into the mud. Just picture this high-powered CEO with his $100 haircut, absolutely wrecked in a Texas mud puddle while a dog treats his face like a piece of bacon. Through the rain, he heard a woman trying to hold back laughter while yelling for the dog, Biscuit, to get off. She walked out barefoot onto the wet porch, covered in flour over a yellow sundress, looking absolutely mortified. Jonathan just laid there in the dirt, looking up at her, while Biscuit kept licking his ear, and for a long moment, nobody said a word. Beatrice Davis had spent 28 years perfecting the art of the graceful exit. Whenever a situation went south, her foolproof system was to simply smile, apologize, and disappear. Except right now, that system had a major flaw named Biscuit. Her golden retriever was currently using the chest of a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of GQ as a personal dog bed. "I am so sorry," she blurted out, repeating it for the 5th time since pulling Biscuit off him. "He's usually so good with strangers. I swear." "It's fine," the man muttered, sitting up slowly and picking a clump of mud off his custom sleeve like he was assessing a bad quarterly report. He glanced down at the ruined fabric before looking back up at her. "Jonathan Cole." "Beatrice Davis," she replied, nervously tucking a stray braid behind her ear before immediately pulling it loose again and crossing her arms. "But everyone calls me B." Now you have to understand that B wasn't the type of woman to get flustered around a handsome guy. She was entirely used to charming customers, flirtatious regulars, and farm boys from the next county coming to the Saturday market just to talk to her. She had a system for that too. Stay busy, keep your hands in the dough, and keep things professional. The issue here was that Jonathan wasn't flirting. He wasn't even acting particularly friendly. He was just watching her with these intense brown eyes, studying her like she was an equation he was trying to solve. And she absolutely hated that it was making her nervous. Because she ran a tight ship, she made him wash his hands at the outdoor spigot before he was allowed anywhere near her kitchen. Once he passed inspection, she pointed him toward a little wooden stool her younger brother usually claimed, and she got right back to work. Since he had just asked for whatever she had, she smoothly pivoted away from a half-finished Sunday market order. Instead, she started whipping up a smaller almond butter cake, layering it with vanilla cream and a heavy salted caramel drizzle that she usually charged double for. Jonathan just sat on that wooden stool, quietly taking her in. If you closed your eyes in Bee's kitchen, it smelled exactly like a Sunday morning in the fall. The air was thick with the scent of browned butter, toasted pecans, and that rich, heavy Mexican vanilla that clings to your clothes for hours. The first thing he noticed was that she wasn't putting on a show for him. In his world, people constantly adjusted themselves when they found out who he was. They stood a little straighter, chose their words carefully, and flashed tight, eager smiles. But Bee just moved around her kitchen like he didn't even exist. She piped the cream with a steady hand, humming some low tune he couldn't recognize, completely absorbed in her craft. It had been a very long time since Jonathan had met someone who cared more about their work than they cared about him, and it completely threw him off balance. By 9:14 p.m., she slid the finished cake across the counter in a neat little box tied with brown twine, quoting a price that was embarrassingly low. "You don't need to tip," she added quickly, clearly stereotyping him. "I know you city guys sometimes feel obligated to—" "How much do I owe you for the jacket?" he interrupted. Bee blinked, caught off guard. "Your jacket? That was completely Biscuit's fault. Biscuit is your dog." "Biscuit is a force of nature," she corrected him with deadpan seriousness, like she had made peace with this fact years ago. "And I take full responsibility for any forces of nature that happen on my property." Jonathan stared at her for a beat. Something subtle shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but definitely not his usual scowl. Without another word, he dropped enough cash on the counter to cover the cake and a massive tip, grabbed the box and headed for the door. Bee had already started scrubbing the counters when he paused in the doorway. "The cake," he said over his shoulder. "Is it always this good, or did the dog help with the recipe?" She didn't even give him the satisfaction of an answer. She just pointed a flour-covered finger straight at the door. And honestly, good for her. Jonathan walked back to room 7 in the pouring rain, mourning the total loss of his jacket, and proceeded to eat the entire cake right there on the edge of the cheap motel bed. It was hands down the best thing he had tasted in years. He sat there thinking about the cake, and then he thought about Bee. He thought about how she hadn't flinched when he stared at her, the smudge of flour on her collarbone she never noticed, and that legendary golden retriever sleeping somewhere behind the yellow gate. He finally tossed the empty box on the nightstand and laid back while the storm raged outside. When he finally woke up to bright sunlight at 7:00 a.m., he realized he had left his ruined jacket sitting right on her front porch. At 8:15 a.m., every cell phone in Milbrook buzzed in unison with a county emergency alert. Route 12 closed. Estimated reopening 96 hours. Debris clearing in progress. Jonathan stared at his screen, reading the text twice just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. 96 hours. Imagine being a guy whose entire identity is tied to his Outlook calendar, suddenly handed 4 empty days in a town where the biggest attraction is a $48 motel room. What do you even do with yourself? He immediately called his assistant to reschedule 3 board meetings and an Austin property walkthrough. After hanging up, he sat at the flimsy desk by the window, staring at the blinking cursor on his laptop. Sure, he had due diligence reports to finish before the end of the month, because his entire life was meticulously architected to ensure there was always something to do. From room 7, the view was mostly just a depressing parking lot, but if you leaned forward and looked slightly left, you could see Bee's yellow gate. By 8:30 a.m., her kitchen lights were already casting a warm golden glow against the grey morning sky. He tried his hardest to ignore it, forcing his eyes back to the spreadsheet, but he only lasted exactly 40 minutes. You know the type. Guys who treat a Sunday afternoon nap like a major character flaw. When the universe finally forces them to hit the brakes, they usually just rev the engine until something catches fire. He managed to scrape together a pretty reasonable excuse to go over there, convincing himself he just needed his jacket back. It was a custom cashmere blazer that cost more than a month's rent in Manhattan, so leaving it on a stranger's porch was completely irresponsible. It obviously had absolutely nothing to do with the woman who had served him the best dessert of his life. He marched up to the yellow gate and knocked. Instead of a furry golden missile, Beatrice opened the door, clutching a spatula and looking like she had mentally prepared herself for someone else entirely. When she realized it was him, she had to visibly adjust her posture. "So your jacket's on the hook by the door set," she pointed out. "I know, I saw it from my window," he replied before wincing. "That came out wrong." "Yeah, a little bit." She kept the door open, and he stayed planted on the porch while the morning air settled between them, smelling strongly of fresh cinnamon. 4 days, Jonathan finally sighed. "I heard." He stopped, trying to find the right words. "I really don't know what to do in a town like this for 4 days. Bea leaned against the doorframe, still holding her spatula. She wasn't pitying him or laughing at his expense. She was just quietly considering him. "Well, I have orders to fill," she started. "But if you're looking to kill time, the Saturday market is tomorrow. Mrs. Calloway runs a downtown walking tour that takes exactly 11 minutes, and there's a decent fishing spot down by the creek, if you ask Roy at the diner." "And what if I just wanted more cake?" She held his gaze for 3 agonizing seconds. "Then I'd tell you to come back at noon and bring your own coffee, because I am definitely not sharing mine." He came back at noon, and she poured him a cup of coffee anyway. Bea's kitchen felt a lot smaller on the inside, especially with 2 people sharing the space. Jonathan found himself back on that same wooden stool, nursing a cup of coffee while watching her work with the effortless precision of someone who had spent years memorizing every inch of her countertops. She was completely in her element, juggling 3 weekend birthday cakes, a massive batch of baby shower cupcakes, and some elaborate multi-tiered creation she casually referred to as a naked cake. He just nodded along, filing the term away to Google later rather than interrupting her flow. There are 2 types of silence in this world: the suffocating, awkward kind where you're desperately searching for something to say, and the rare golden kind where you just exist together without needing to fill the empty air. Throughout his career, Jonathan had weaponized silence. He used it as a tactical advantage during brutal board negotiations or to freeze out a bad pitch. But sitting in Bea's kitchen, the quiet had a totally different texture. It was just the rhythmic scrape of a whisk against a bowl, the dull hum of the oven, and the soft click-clack of biscuits' paws resettling on the linoleum. Do you know what makes that kind of comfortable silence so incredibly dangerous? You completely stop guarding yourself. You stop calculating your next move and actually start speaking your mind instead of running every thought through a corporate PR filter. Somewhere around the 2-hour mark, he finally spoke up, asking if she baked like this every single day. Keeping her eyes locked on a white cake, she piped intricate little rosettes with the laser focus of a surgeon and explained her 6-day-a-week grind before flipping the question back on him. She wanted to know what his daily routine looked like, pointing out he had neatly avoided mentioning it. Gripping his mug, he explained his role running an agribusiness firm that acquired agricultural land, restructured operations, and leased it back to regional producers. Bea piped 3 more perfect rosettes before summarizing his job as buying up family farms and renting them right back to the farmers. He hesitated, trying to argue that it was an oversimplification, but when she pressed him on whether she was actually wrong, he had to concede. She just gave a single nod, mentally filing that information away, and went right back to decorating. When he asked if her summary bothered her, she simply pointed out that he was the one getting defensive about it. There is something incredibly magnetic about a person who can drop an absolute truth bomb and then casually go right back to frosting a cupcake without waiting for applause. He ended up staying until 4:30 in the afternoon, even helping her carry the finished bakery boxes to a small commercial fridge in the back room just because she asked. As a reward, she handed him a slice from a test batch, a dense cardamom and brown butter cake with a lingering honey glaze. When he asked where she learned to bake like that, she credited her grandmother, heavily supplemented by late-night YouTube tutorials. That pulled a genuine, completely unscripted laugh right out of his chest. Bea looked up, surprised by the sound, before casually mentioning that he should laugh more because it completely changed his entire face. He was almost out the yellow gate when she called out from the porch, asking for his actual first name instead of the stiff, corporate card version. Standing in the doorway, backlit by that warm kitchen glow, she told Jonathan that if he wanted anything the next day, he needed to text her by 8. He walked straight back to room 7, sat on the edge of the squeaky bed, and sent her a text at exactly 7:59 p.m. In a place like Milbrook, gossip travels significantly faster than the local broadband. By Saturday morning, the farmers' market was completely ignoring the storm damage and the highway closures, buzzing entirely about the mysterious guy from room 7 who had practically moved into B. Davis's house over the last 2 days. Dorothy Sims, the lady running the plant stall 3 tables down, had already launched a full FBI-level background check. She cornered B between customers at 9:15 a.m., shoving her phone forward like a smoking gun loaded with a LinkedIn profile, an old Forbes mention, and a Dallas Morning News headshot. "Jonathan Cole," Dorothy whispered aggressively. "President and CEO of Cole Agribusiness Group, net worth, and I am going to quote this directly, because I need you to hear the number." Dorothy. "Approximately 4.6 billion. Dorothy, I really have to box these up. Beatrice Renee Davis. You currently have a billionaire sitting on your kitchen stool eating your test batches. Have you ever experienced that sudden, stomach-dropping vertigo of realizing the floor is much farther down than you thought? That was exactly the kind of dizzy B was dealing with right now. She sold out of her baked goods by 11 and spent the entire walk home turning that massive number over in her head. $4.6 billion. He was the exact type of corporate titan whose ruthless decisions actively swallowed up small-town agricultural economies just like Milbrook's. He had absolutely no logical reason to sit in her tiny kitchen for 2 afternoons in a row. When a woman realizes the guy sitting at her counter isn't just a stranded traveler, but someone who could literally buy her entire zip code in cash, a serious survival instinct kicks in. You start replaying every casual interaction, mentally building up the walls you accidentally let down, and wondering if you were just a temporary amusement park ride for a guy bored out of his mind. B tried to convince herself she just needed to recalibrate and establish some professional distance. She would stop making his morning coffee first. She would stop saving him the best test slices. The problem was that none of those actions had actually felt like a mistake when she was doing them. But B was a deeply pragmatic woman. She understood her own worth, but she also possessed that pre-installed rural wisdom that told her guys like Jonathan Cole never actually stay. They parachute in, act charmed by the simple country life for a few days, and then the highway opens up and they vanish back to their penthouses. She had watched it happen to plenty of other local girls, and she absolutely refused to be someone's rural detour. She went to bed early that night, actively forcing herself not to glance toward the motel. When her phone lit up at 8:07 p.m. with a text from him, just checking to see if she was okay since there was no order, she stared at the glowing screen for a long time before putting it away and going to sleep. Sunday passed quietly in a blur of baking bread, walking biscuit, and calling her mother, while giving the yellow gate a very wide berth. By Monday morning, she had fully convinced herself she'd made the right call to cut him off. And then came the knock at the door. When the knock finally came at 9:15 a.m., B already knew exactly who was on the porch. Biscuit had just lifted his head from the floor and immediately set it back down. The ultimate golden retriever signal for, "I know who it is, so this one is your call." She sighed and pulled the door open. Jonathan Cole was standing there in a slightly less ruined jacket, balancing 2 takeout cups from the local diner. He extended one toward her, wearing the exhausted expression of a guy who had rehearsed a massive speech, and then decided to just scrap the whole thing. "I know who you think I am," he started. B just crossed her arms, ignoring the peace offering. "Dorothy has a massive mouth." "Dorothy was just looking out for you, so I can't really blame her," he replied, setting the extra cup on the porch railing. "I should have been up front from the beginning, and that is entirely on me. It is incredibly hard to stay mad at someone who leads with pure accountability instead of throwing out cheap excuses." B had spent the last 36 hours building a perfectly solid brick wall around her feelings, but watching this billionaire swallow his pride and just admit he was wrong made that wall really difficult to justify. She finally relented and took the coffee, though she kept him out on the porch as a reasonable compromise while the morning air warmed up, smelling like wet cedar from the back fence. "What do you actually want out of this?" she asked, holding his gaze. "Not from the town, not from the market, "What do you want from me?" He actually took a moment to think about it instead of just firing off a slick, rehearsed PR answer. "I really don't know yet," he admitted softly. "And I am almost never in a position where I don't know things. I find it incredibly uncomfortable." "Good." He blinked, totally caught off guard. "Good. You've probably been way too comfortable for way too long," she said, taking a sip of her coffee. "If you want to come inside, you can come inside. But your free trial as an audience member is over. If you're in my kitchen today, you are actually going to help." Honestly, seeing a high-powered CEO get immediately humbled and put to work by a small-town baker is the exact kind of energy we all need in our lives. Her assigned project for him was decorating a dozen birthday sugar cookies, which required piping a delicate pink royal icing flower on each one. She walked him through a slow demonstration, explaining the exact angle, pressure, and release of the bag. Naturally, Jonathan held the piping bag like it was an unexploded bomb. "Try not to overthink it," she warned. "I am definitely not overthinking," he muttered. "You're literally holding your breath." He let out a long exhale and gave it a shot, but his first flower came out looking like a tiny, tragic pink explosion. He just stared at the cookie with the deeply offended expression of a guy who is naturally good at everything and had just been brutally reminded of his own limitations. Bea clamped her lips together to keep from losing it. "Go ahead and laugh," he said flatly. She let out a genuine deep belly laugh that completely filled the kitchen, prompting Biscuit to lift his head and give a single wag of solidarity. Jonathan gritted his teeth and tried again, producing a second flower that was marginally better and a third that was at least identifiable as plant life. As he struggled with the fourth, Bea stepped in to show him how to correct his pressure, resting her fingers directly over his to adjust his grip. The laughter instantly died in her throat. For a split second, neither of them breathed, letting the heavy weight of the contact hang in the air for exactly as long as it needed to. Finally, she stepped back and cleared her throat, instructing him to try the next one solo. It actually turned out pretty well. They spent the rest of the afternoon deliberately ignoring that little spark of electricity, but the entire vibe of the kitchen had fundamentally shifted into something completely new. To Bea's absolute surprise, Jonathan was actually the one who suggested they take a walk. She had completely assumed he would want to stay holed up in her kitchen, a controlled environment with a defined task and zero risk of running into half the county on a Tuesday afternoon, in a place where everyone knew everyone's middle name and exactly what they did to earn it. A walk down Main Street was practically a press conference, but she should have remembered that she didn't fully have him figured out just yet. If you're picturing Milbrook on a Tuesday afternoon, you are probably entirely accurate. You've got muddy pickup trucks angle-parked in front of the local hardware store, a group of retirees holding court on the bench outside the barbershop, and the heavy, smoky smell of barbecue drifting out of the diner before noon. And right in the middle of it all was Bea Davis, walking straight down Main Street with a man who was very clearly, in the exact words of Dorothy Sims, not from around here. Bea kept the introduction simple, introducing him only as Jonathan. He took every single handshake and nod in stride, completely leaving out the company name, the CEO title, and the billions of dollars. When 73-year-old Mrs. Calloway, the undefeated heavyweight champion of local gossip, stopped them outside the flower shop to interrogate him, he simply said he was from Dallas. Instead of taking over the conversation, he just stood there and let her talk about the storm damage to her prized back garden. Bea quietly watched him do this. She watched him actually listen, not just perform that fake polite nodding that people do when they're just waiting for their turn to speak. He listened to Ray at the hardware store complaining about a downed fence, and he gave his full attention to the Alvarez kids who ran up just to show Biscuit a muddy frog they'd caught in the creek. He even listened intently when Bea pointed out the massive oak tree at the end of Main Street. She explained that it had been planted by Milbrook's very first black family back in 1923 and had somehow survived a century's worth of Texas storms. Small towns are funny like that. People drive through them at 60 miles an hour and just see faded paint and empty storefronts. But if you actually stop, you realize that every cracked sidewalk, every rusted sign, and every single tree has a story that someone fought incredibly hard to preserve. Jonathan reached out and rested his hand against the rough bark for a long moment before moving on. He didn't say a word, and honestly, that quiet respect was exactly the right response. Watching someone who has spent their entire life optimizing every single second finally encounter a world where time actually slows down is fascinating. First comes the obvious discomfort, the anxious itch of having no schedule and no defined purpose. But if they're actually a person worth paying attention to, a softening follows. A genuine unscripted curiosity takes over. You can't fake that kind of shift. It's either in you or it isn't. They eventually wandered over to the picnic tables behind the church, the unofficial gathering spot after the Saturday market. Jonathan sat there devouring a pulled pork sandwich from the diner, like a man who had completely forgotten that food could actually taste like something other than catered boardroom lunches. "You really love this town," he observed. It wasn't a question. "I do." "Have you ever wanted to leave?" B thought about it for a second. "Sometimes. Back when I was 22 or 23, I thought I needed to go somewhere much bigger just to prove something." She looked back down the length of Main Street, taking in the barbershop, the hardware store, and that old water tower with Milbrook painted in faded blue letters. "But I think I just confused bigger with better." Jonathan was quiet for a long time. "I think I did too," he finally admitted softly. "Just in the completely opposite direction." Before she could even ask him what he meant by that, she saw him. Her father, Joseph Davis, was standing completely still at the corner of the hardware store, with his arms folded across his chest. He was watching them with the calm, deeply measured expression of a man who had built his entire life on patience and was currently using every last ounce of it. His eyes found B's, and then they slowly shifted to Jonathan. The message in that stare was perfectly clear, and it absolutely did not require a translation. Joseph Davis was absolutely not the kind of man who raised his voice to make a point. He had learned a long time ago that guys who shout are usually the ones who have already lost the argument, and in his 40 years he had never once needed to yell to be heard. He spoke with total precision, moved deliberately, and when he finally had something to say, he only had to say it once. Jonathan found this out the hard way the very next morning. He had walked down to the local diner for breakfast, fully adopting the small-town morning ritual that had zero equivalent in his actual high-speed life. Joseph was already sitting at the counter, nursing a mug and reading a folded newspaper with the unhurried, grounded focus of a man who had absolutely nowhere else to be. Jonathan ordered his coffee and quietly took a seat 2 stools down. Joseph didn't even acknowledge his presence for a full minute before speaking. "You're the guy staying at the Lone Pine." "Yes, sir." "Jonathan Cole." He didn't ask it like a question. He stated it the exact way people do when they've already run the background check. Joseph carefully folded his newspaper and set it flat on the counter. "I know who you are. If you've ever sat in a room with a father who fiercely loves his daughter but deeply distrusts your intentions, you know exactly how heavy that specific brand of silence feels. It isn't hostile, at least not yet. It's purely evaluative. You can practically hear him running the numbers on you, and that pressure makes you desperate to say something, anything, to tip the scales in your favor. But you have to bite your tongue, because you know whatever you say will inevitably tip them the wrong way. "My daughter is a good woman," Joseph stated plainly, skipping the pleasantries entirely. "She is," Jonathan agreed. "She works incredibly hard. She built that entire business herself from absolutely nothing when she was 22, using a beat-up stand mixer she dragged home from a yard sale." He wrapped both of his weathered hands around his coffee mug. "She is not just some temporary experience for you." Jonathan didn't flinch, but he also didn't have a slick, ready-made answer chambered, which was probably the most honest reaction he'd had in years. He had literally built a multi-billion-dollar empire on his ability to project absolute confidence in any boardroom. Yet, sitting on a vinyl stool in a diner with Beatrice's father, he found himself completely stripped of his rehearsed armor. "I don't have any hidden intentions," he finally admitted. "I mean, I don't really have a plan at all. And I know that isn't very reassuring." "It's not." "I know what I want right now," Jonathan said quietly. "I just don't always know what that actually means yet." Joseph just stared at him for a long, agonizing time. long enough for the waitress to swing by and top off both their mugs without either man breaking eye contact. "Guys exactly like you always pass through towns like this," Joseph finally said, his voice low and steady. "You find something real and different, and it feels incredible because it's a break from your usual routine. But then the highway opens back up. You realize that different thing doesn't actually fit into your real life, and you inevitably go right back to what you know." He picked up his mug and took a slow sip. "And the thing you left behind doesn't just recover the same way you do. There is something profoundly intimidating about a father who doesn't need to threaten you with a shotgun to protect his kid. He just lays out the cold, hard truth of the situation and forces you to look at the damage you're capable of causing. That kind of quiet, fiercely protective love is impossible to argue against." Jonathan had absolutely no response to that, not because Joseph was wrong, but because he was entirely right. He walked back to the motel with his coffee cooling in his hand, sat heavily on the edge of the bed in room 7, and just stared blankly at the cheap paneling. Route 12 was opening in less than 48 hours. He didn't even notice Beatrice was out there until the familiar creak of her porch steps gave her away. He stepped over to the window and saw her standing just behind the yellow gate, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she stared down the street in the direction of the main road. She had heard them, and he knew it just by the way she deliberately refused to look at his window. Tuesday dragged on with a heavy, fragile tension hanging in the air. Instead of basking in that comfortable kitchen silence from the day before, Bea threw herself into filling orders with the laser focus of someone desperately trying to keep their mind occupied. She deliberately avoided the yellow gate and completely ignored the single text he sent at noon asking to talk, simply because she wasn't ready yet. Let's get one thing straight. Bea wasn't hiding because she was scared. She was just thinking, and society rarely gives women enough credit for taking a pause that is purely about careful consideration rather than hesitation. She was busy weighing the stark difference between what was actually real and what was just a fantasy. And sometimes you just need a solid afternoon alone with a piping bag to figure out which is which. At 7 EOZO p.m. sharp, her phone buzzed with the final county alert. Route 12 cleared. Travel resuming Wednesday morning. Standing there with flour covering her hands, she froze, letting Biscuit press a comforting weight against her leg while her eyes drifted to the glowing light shining from room 7. You want to know what the absolute hardest part of all this was for her? Dealing with the fact that she had caught feelings was the easy part. She was a grown adult who could handle her own heart. The devastating reality was that Jonathan had 0 hidden angles and put on absolutely no performance. He was just a guy who laughed when her dog tackled him, miserably failed at piping icing flowers, genuinely listened to an old woman's garden stories, and actually absorbed her father's harsh truth without getting defensive. Honestly, walking away from a genuinely good man is infinitely harder than walking away from a jerk. Wednesday morning dawned bright and clear, completely ignoring the emotional wreckage the storm had left behind. Jonathan officially checked out of the Lone Pine right at 9 o'clock. Standing in her kitchen with her back firmly to the window, Bea listened to the familiar sequence of departure, the heavy thud of the room 7 door, the slam of a car trunk, and the squeak of the driver's side hinges, then just dead silence. She stood there holding her breath, waiting for the inevitable roar of the engine. Sometimes the loudest sound in the world is the thing that doesn't happen. The engine never started. Slowly turning toward the window, she saw him standing frozen next to his car, with his hand resting flat on the roof. He wasn't looking at her house. He was staring straight down the road toward the highway, toward Dallas, and toward the massive empire waiting for his return. Then, he just dropped his gaze to his shoes, and he stayed exactly where he was. By 9:14 a.m., Jonathan was marching right back into the motel lobby to book room 7 for another night. Dolores at the front desk definitely raised an eyebrow, but true to small-town etiquette, she kept her thoughts to herself and let him make his own choices. He fired off a quick string of emails to his assistant, who was seasoned enough to never ask questions above her pay grade, rescheduling his Austin walkthrough and totally clearing his morning. Sitting at that tiny, wobbly desk, he genuinely tried to rationalize what the hell he was doing, but the logic just wasn't quite there. All he really understood was that spending 5 days in this cheap room had somehow made him feel like an actual human being instead of just a corporate title. He realized that Bee's kitchen was the very first place in years he actually wanted to stay, and even though her father had been absolutely right about the risks, that cold logic just wasn't enough to make him start the engine and drive away. He grabbed 2 fresh coffees from the diner and knocked on the yellow gate at 9:45 a.m. Now, if you had told Bee an hour earlier that she would actually open that door, she probably would have fought you on it. She had spent her entire morning building a totally airtight, logical case for why she needed to keep him locked out, even rehearsing the bullet points out loud to Biscuit, who just listened respectfully before immediately going back to sleep. But the funny thing about building a purely logical case is that it falls apart the second new unpredictable variables show up on your porch. She swung the door open, and he just held out the coffee. Instead of delivering a perfectly polished corporate pitch to win her over, he just stood there looking exhausted and completely stripped of his usual armor. "I just didn't want to leave yet," he admitted softly. "That's honestly all I have." She took the cup and simply told him to come inside. There is a very specific, incredibly rare kind of courage in showing up empty-handed. No grand promises, no rehearsed arguments, just a quiet willingness to stand there and admit you don't want to walk away. In a world where everyone is constantly trying to sell you something, pure, uncalculated honesty is genuinely breathtaking. They ended up talking straight through until 1 in the afternoon. They pushed past the easy, surface-level kitchen banter and waded right into the heavy, complicated stuff that happens when 2 people decide to finally drop their guard and go somewhere deeper. He opened up about the real, messy version of his company rather than the glossy Forbes profile. He talked about an aggressive expansion that nearly broke him in his 20s, the collateral damage of relationships he sacrificed for a deal, and the slow, creeping isolation of losing trust in everyone around him. In return, Bee explained the profound intentional courage it takes to plant your roots in a small town like Milbrook when you have the talent to go anywhere else. Biscuit, naturally, slept through the entire emotional breakthrough. In a Hollywood movie, this is the exact moment where they would say all the perfect lines. The music would swell and everything would cleanly click into place. But real life is so much messier and far more honest than that. This was just 2 adults in a tiny Texas kitchen making a completely unguarded choice to see if this connection was actually worth the risk. By 3 o'clock, Jonathan took Biscuit for a long walk down to the creek, a routine the golden retriever accepted with the absolute dignity of a dog who had been waiting for this exact outcome all along. But when Jonathan finally looped back toward the house, Joseph Davis's battered truck was already parked right outside the yellow gate. The 2 men locked eyes from across the yard. Instead of waiting for the older man to approach him, Jonathan tightened his grip on the leash, squared his shoulders, and walked straight toward the confrontation. Jonathan asked Joseph for 20 minutes of his time, and Joseph gave him 30. There's a silent, unspoken respect that happens when you honor a man's boundaries enough to ask for a moment, and he responds by giving you more than you requested. They posted up on the back porch of the Davis family home, just a few streets over, settling into low patio chairs facing a meticulously kept garden. Bee's mother dropped off 2 glasses of sweet iced tea before quietly slipping back inside, displaying the graceful intuition of a woman who has been married for decades and knows exactly when to leave 2 men alone. Jonathan took the lead. He bypassed all the corporate doublespeak and laid his cards flat on the table. "I came here to give you my word on what I can control," Jonathan stated firmly. "I lack a perfect roadmap for where this is heading, but my days of just passing through are officially over. I need you to understand that I recognize the difference between a temporary detour and an actual destination." Joseph just held his cold glass, listening closely. "Everything you said at the diner was dead on," Jonathan continued. "Guys in my position have a nasty habit of grabbing onto something genuine, holding it just long enough to feel alive, and then dropping it the second it clashes with our reality. I've absolutely been that guy. I refuse to sit here and pretend my past looks any different." He paused, letting the heavy Texas air settle between them. "I'm telling you that I am actively choosing to change who I am. Real proof never comes from a beautifully rehearsed apology or a grand romantic monologue. Anybody can string pretty words together. True proof is raw and uncomfortable. It's the quiet, terrifying willingness to completely dismantle the life you've built just to make room for someone else. They sat in the heavy afternoon quiet, the only sound coming from a neighbor's lawnmower a few streets over. "B is entirely capable of rescuing herself," Joseph stated flatly. "I am fully aware of that. She has her own money and she is perfectly content with the exact size of her world." "I know that too." Joseph locked eyes with him. "Then what exactly are you bringing to the table?" Jonathan took a deep breath. "Consistency. My actual presence. The absolute willingness to figure out how to merge two completely different lives." He set his glass down on the wooden side table, "and the upfront honesty to admit that while I lack the exact blueprints right now, I am asking for the opportunity to build them with her. Have you ever noticed how the most powerful negotiations happen when you completely strip away your leverage?" He brought zero guarantees, skipped the grand master plan, and threw away the contract. He was just a guy sitting in a backyard, offering terrifying vulnerability to a fiercely protective father. And honestly, sometimes laying down your armor is the only way to actually win the room. Instead of offering a warm hug or officially welcoming him to the family, Joseph simply gave a single slow nod and took a quiet sip of his tea. In the stoic language of Joseph Davis, that was a signed permission slip to keep trying. Jonathan headed straight back toward the motel, stopping firmly at the yellow gate. When he knocked and B opened the door, he stood there completely empty-handed. He ditched the coffee cups, the pastry boxes, and the casual excuses, bringing only himself. "I need to show you something tomorrow," he told her directly. "If you're willing to come with me." She studied his face for a long beat. "Where are we going?" "Wherever you say yes to." Thursday morning came in warm and golden, the last gasp of summer light that Texas gives you in September, before the season starts its slow turn. Beatrice was up at 6, old habit. The oven didn't care about dramatic moments, and she was piping the border on a wedding cake order when she heard the squeak of the yellow gate. She'd told him 10 o'clock. It was 9:48. She let him in without comment. He sat on the stool, watching in silence as her slightly trembling hands finished the delicate work. The tension in the air was palpable, almost electric. When she finally untied her apron, she took a deep breath, turned to him and said, "Okay, I'm ready." He'd said, "Wherever you say yes." She'd thought about that all night, tossing and turning with a racing heart. "The square," she whispered. "I want to show you something there." He simply nodded, offering his hand. As his fingers intertwined with hers, a jolt of warmth traveled up her arm, anchoring her entirely in the present. "The square in Milbrook isn't the kind of square you'd write home about. It's a circle, technically, a small park with a fountain that hasn't worked since 2019, 2 magnolia trees, and 4 benches where people sit after church and argue about football. But on a Thursday morning in September, with the light coming in at that perfect golden angle and the magnolias still rich and green, it is genuinely beautiful. It's the kind of beauty ordinary things take on when you finally stop moving fast enough and just allow yourself to feel. And with Jonathan's hand holding mine, firm and warm, that patch of grass felt like the center of the universe. Walking slowly, Beatrice was telling him about the fountain, how the town had tried 3 times to fix it, how the 3rd attempt had ended in a minor flood that was now local legend. She was laughing softly, but stopped abruptly when she realized he wasn't looking at the dry stone fountain. He was looking at her, with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. Her smile faltered. A heavy, expectant silence fell between them. Slowly, without breaking eye contact, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Beatrice watched him, confused for a fraction of a second and then perfectly, absolutely still. He pulled out a ring, plain and simple, an elegant gold band with a small oval stone the color of dark honey, catching the morning sun. "Here's what you need to understand about this moment. It was not a proposal in a fancy restaurant with string music and a chef who was in on it. It was not rehearsed, it was not grand in the way of things designed to go viral or be paraded at dinner parties. It was just a man in a small Texas square, in the middle of an absolutely ordinary Thursday, getting down on one knee in front of a woman who made birthday cakes, walked a chaos dog, and had sat with him in complete silence until he remembered how to be a person again. And around them, slowly, in the curious, nosy way that only small towns have. The world stopped. Roy stepped out of the diner, wiping his hands on his apron. Dorothy Sims parked her plant delivery van. Mrs. Calloway, doing her Tuesday errands on a Thursday, because she always got the days mixed up, dropped her canvas bag. 3 kids slammed the brakes on their bikes. And Beatrice's neighbor, who had apparently been watching from her porch since they arrived, pressed both hands to her cheeks. Jonathan's voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was gravelly, deep, and vibrating with a piercing sincerity. I know this is fast. I know I have about 6 more reasons than I have answers. I know your father is going to want a very long conversation with me, and I know perfectly well this town is going to talk about this for years. He looked up, meeting Beatrice's tear-filled eyes. Before you, Bea, I was just a ghost walking on autopilot. You brought the light back, you brought me back. He swallowed hard, the emotion threatening to spill over. I'm asking you to build something with me. Not my life, not your life. Something completely new that belongs only to the 2 of us. I don't know exactly what the script looks like from here on out, but I know with every cell in my body that I want to find out by your side. Will you marry me? He wasn't just offering a gold ring, he was offering the only place in the world where I always knew I belonged. Beatrice Davis looked at Jonathan Cole, on one knee in the middle of the Milbrook Square, with Roy and Dorothy and Mrs. Calloway and 3 children on bikes as their witnesses, and said absolutely nothing. The whole town waited. She looked at the ring, then at his face, at the raw hope and vulnerability shining in his eyes. Tears spilled over, tracing warm paths down her cheeks. Then, the corner of her mouth moved, a soft tremor that bloomed into a radiant, breathtaking smile. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking. Yes. The square held its breath. She didn't wait for him to slip the ring on. Beatrice dropped to her knees right there on the damp grass, throwing her arms around his neck. The impact made Jonathan let out a broken laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, before he pulled her in for a passionate, desperate, and completely surrendered kiss. His hands cupped her face firmly, their lips meeting with the urgency of 2 people who had waited their whole lives for this exact embrace. And then Milbrook finally breathed, erupting into cheers and whistles all around them. 6 months later, Jonathan Cole didn't buy a company, a tech startup, or a glass and steel skyscraper in downtown Dallas. He didn't execute a leveraged leaseback or worry about regional operators. Instead, he bought 40 acres of rolling land just outside the Milbrook city limits. It was the kind of Texas dirt that ran dark and rich after a heavy rain, where the horizon stretched out in every direction like a long-held breath. He wasn't dismantling his empire, he was simply building something that actually mattered. His life became a rhythm of contrasts, a high-rise office in Dallas from Monday to Wednesday, and a mud-splattered truck on a back road to Milbrook every Thursday evening. And every single time he pulled up, Biscuit was there at the gate, barking with the wild, tail-thumping enthusiasm of a creature who never held a grudge for the days he was away. People ask me sometimes, because in a town like this, they always ask if any of this is actually realistic. A billionaire CEO and a small-town baker from the heart of Texas. And when they do, I think about Bea in her kitchen at 6 in the morning, her hair dusted with flour and her eyes bright with purpose. I think about Jonathan, a man who used to command boardrooms, sitting at her kitchen island and learning how to pipe frosting flowers with the focused intensity of someone diffusing a bomb. I think about a chaotic dog knocking a man in a $1,000 cashmere jacket flat into the Texas mud, and both of them coming up laughing. And I think realistic compared to what? Some love stories start with a 5-year plan and a background check. Ours started with a wrong turn in a lightning storm and a desperate last-minute cake order. The farmer's market on the first Saturday of February was Beatrice's biggest win yet. She had 3 new stalls, a fresh hire, and a digital ordering system that Dorothy had helped her build, with a level of enthusiasm that more than made up for her total lack of technical skill. Jonathan was right there in the thick of it. He was hauling heavy wooden crates and stacking boxes, an unofficial, unpaid Saturday morning job that he would have never predicted putting on his calendar a year ago. He looked rugged, relaxed, and more at home than he ever had in a tailored suit. Joseph Davis appeared at exactly 11 o'clock. He bought a thick slice of Beatrice's brown butter cardamom cake, her absolute best, the one she charged double for, and ate it slowly, standing at the very edge of the bustling market. He watched them for a long time. Finally, he wiped his hands and walked over to Jonathan, who was breaking down empty cake boxes by the tailgate of the truck. Jonathan looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead, and for a second, the air between them went still. Joseph didn't say a word. He just held out his weathered, calloused hand. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He reached out and took it, the two men sharing a firm, silent handshake that carried more weight than any legal contract Jonathan had ever signed. It wasn't just a greeting. It was an acceptance. It was a welcome home. I've always believed that the best things in life are the ones you never saw coming, the ones that catch you off guard and change your entire trajectory. So I have to ask, have you ever had a moment where a wrong turn led you exactly where you were meant to be? What's the most surprising way love has shown up in your life without any warning at all? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. And somewhere on the other side of that familiar yellow gate, in a kitchen that smelled forever like vanilla, salted caramel, and 40 acres of beautiful possibility, Biscuit was already waiting at the door. The end.